As a general rule, only the facts of essentially prosecution of executioners and criminals of the Third Reich are known in historiography. However, there is plentiful evidence that many criminals did not live to see that very trial, executed by partisans, soldiers, local residents, and liberated prisoners of concentration camps. This is Flip Side of History channel, and now we'll tell you about Nazis, or rather about the Hitlerites who were executed in unusual ways. Let us continue. For one example, in the report of one of the military units, written in 1942, it is indicated that a reconnaissance platoon scout could not deliver a so-called living tongue for a long time. The thing is that the soldier learned about the massacre of civilians by the Nazis in his native village, that his sister or sisters were brutally raped before their death. After that incident, the soldiers of the captured Nazis were beaten to death by fists. Already after the liberation of Belarus, the fact of reprisals against a former concentration camp guard was documented. Local residents were involved in the construction of a military airfield by the Red Army. There, many paid attention to the peasant who stood out for his diligence and persistence. The locals, taking a closer look, identified him as a guard at the Kaldych of a concentration camp, where 22,000 Soviet citizens were brutally killed. The executioner was twisted by the peasants, at the same time reporting to a lieutenant who was passing nearby. He ordered his soldiers to tie the guard to the tail of the horse, which was then set at a gallop. It's horrendous, but at the end, the body of the executioner was scattered on the territory of the airfield under construction. Captured Nazi guards and those who helped them, who tried to escape from execution after they had been handed over by the Allies, were simply crushed by tanks. This fact has been also documented. There was also a case of unusual shooting of prisoners. A tank platoon captured the village under cover of darkness. The garrison surrendered almost without a fight. It was decided to place the prisoners in a barn until their ultimate fate was decided. Nevertheless, when the tankers opened the gates of the barn, they saw two crossbars, on one of which children were hanged, and opposite, domestic animals, cats and dogs. More than that, the children were ranked according to the height, the tallest, then smaller and shorter in height, and animals in front of the children were hung in the same order. While the officers stood simply bewildered by what they saw, one driver started the tank and crashed into the crowd of captured Nazis, crushing several people with his tracks. After the children were buried in a common grave, the prisoners were forced to carry the crushed bodies to a barn. The tankers drove all the surviving Nazis there. Then this barn was shot with tank guns. Partisans also often did not stand on ceremony with the Nazis. Given that there was no need for additional hungry mouths in the forest, captured Nazis were most often simply shot. However, there were also cases of quite, we can say, exotic executions. For one instance, in winter, a Nazi prisoner was stripped naked. His manhood edition was just ripped off of him. Then it was put in his mouth, and then the frozen sculpture was placed in a visible place by the road, with a sign hanging around his neck, womb and egg. As a whole, the partisans' decision on the fate of prisoners was often made on the basis of the degree of atrocities to which the Hitlerites had fallen. There were cases when partisans, in revenge for the burned village, also burned alive in the forest fascist punishers and policemen. On top of that, quite often the executioners and their accomplices were simply drowned in the swamps. This was the most effective method of execution, which did not require the waste of ammunition, which was, by the way, always in short supply. The partisans also forced the Hitlerites to run through a minefield until everyone was killed. This type of execution appeared after the Nazis sent civilians to clear the roads, when many died from explosions. There is documentary evidence of the brutal reprisals of the so-called savage guerrillas, who fought on their own, paying no attention whatsoever to the common rules of war. While savage guerrillas, consisting of local residents, as a rule, took revenge on the punishers very cruelly, believing that a simple shooting was too lenient a punishment. This is an extract from the memo. Especially cruel were those who were among partisans. I witnessed how the policemen were beaten until they bled, cut with knives, set fire to the hair on their heads, tied by the legs and dragged on a lasso through the forest on a horse, cauterized with hot tea or water. And the diary of the commander of the partisan detachment tells how the partisans dealt with spies who were captured. At the headquarters of the unit, I baptized one particular spy who was brought in early in the morning. After his baptization, the partisans who fled destroyed this bastard with sticks, beating them, pushing them with truncheons and even pouring boiling water on them. At the same time, the Burgomaster, a faithful servant of the Germans, was brought in. In the evening, he was brought to the headquarters of the unit, where he was finished off by a partisan hand. They beat this bastard with whatever they could. In addition to that, they poured boiling water over him. Also, in one of the villages of the Dolgosolchansky village council, partisans captured a Nazi detachment. The prisoners were hanged with a frightening partisan invention. The gallows were mounted on carts, then the horses were smeared with mustard under their tails, and then off they went. For all those who thought of joining the occupiers, such a performance quickly discouraged any will to cooperate with the Nazis. At times, the partisans executed the punishers with their own hands. So, in the village of Glashevka, a detachment of policemen in the amount of 23 people was captured. In order not to drag everyone with him, the commander of the partisan group loudly announced, "You see, there are too many of you. We don't need that many. Only half of you will go to the camp with us. So you gotta figure out for yourselves who will go further and who will stay here. There are enough logs in the barn for this." After that, the policemen were locked in a barn, where they themselves began to beat each other to death with given logs. Some survived. Of course, no one led them anywhere. They all were just shot. Prisoners were pretty often stabbed to death with bayonets. Again, this referred more to savage partisans, although similar methods of execution were also used by regular partisans. Of course, no one punished these partisans for such applied methods. There is a documented occurrence when the commander of a partisan detachment asked the soldiers what to do with the prisoners. In response to the question, he offered to stab a volunteer executioner. Partisan Selesnev came out, at whose house the Nazis burned the whole family. He commanded the prisoners to lie down on the ground one by one and then stabbed the executioners with several blows of the bayonet. Captured Abwehr agents were often dealt with fairly quietly. Realizing that agents had joined the unit instead of real fighters, the partisans, as a rule, either mixed poison into their food or quietly slit their throats at night. It might seem strange, but the most sophisticated methods of execution applied to captured Hitlerites were made by the Americans. For one example, in the American zone of occupation, the so-called death squads of Mayor Murray Burns, who dreamed of getting a revenge for the murdered Jews, operated. The veritable number of those executed by the squadrons is unknown, but some American historians believe there were several thousand. Moreover, they killed the discovered Nazis in the most innovative ways. Some were thrown out of the window to the sound of whistles and hoots. Some were drowned. They could be blown up with a grenade or just receive a cut to their throats. With the exception of the squadrons, the rest of the American soldiers behaved, to put it mildly, harshly. This was especially true for German tankers. You see, in 1944, the Nazi 1st Panzer Corps completely defeated the American army in the Ardennes. And although about 100 captured tankers were shot by the verdict of the tribunal, many simply did not live to see this trial, dying from inhumane tortures. Prisoners were beaten, forced to drink urine, lick spit from the floor, squeeze and flatten their genitals, and many simply had their heads smashed. The most imaginative execution of captured Hitlerites was the punishment of the executioners of the concentration camp. Without protective equipment, they were forced to carry and bury their often decomposed corpses. A lot of people contracted infections or simply died from poisoning from corpse poison. At the end, prisoners of concentration camps who had been released were often brutally dealing with their tormentors without any unnecessary papers, trial, or investigation. Having no weapons, exhausted by constant torture and humiliation, people beat their tormentors to death with shovels and sticks, drowned them in wells, strangled them with ropes, broke their throats with their feet, smashed their heads with stones, nailed some alive to poles, and stoned to death. And female prisoners often tore their guards and executioners to pieces. There have been cases of guards being placed in torture machines for beatings and consequently beaten to death. You're watching Flip Side of History. Thank you for watching this episode. Keep an eye on new episodes and subscribe as well as leave a like to get notified when new episodes will come out. And for now, we see you later.